Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on tonight's program. We are very excited to be here with you. My name is Selena Bemak, and I am the Programs and Communications Coordinator for the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Um, I am here with you at A Lesser Mortal, The Life of a Suffragist and Coal Industry Leader with Sarah Cochran. A few notes before we get started with tonight's program. HSP's library was founded in 1824, and it proudly serves as Philadelphia's Library of American History, with over 21 million manuscripts, going on 22, that represent historic stories of all types. And some other housekeeping notes. I've started recording the program, and it will be sent to everybody in a follow-up email, everyone who registered for tonight. I have also enabled the closed captioning button. So if you see on your little down bar, there is a CC button if you need closed captioning. There it is. Live transcripts are now on. We will have some time for questions at the end, and we will also be doing a Q&A with myself and Kimberly, but go ahead and use the Q&A box or the chat throughout the program as you think of your questions. And of course, please let us know where you are zooming in from the chat. I already see 1 or 2 people letting us know where they are coming in from. And we are in webinar mode, which means we cannot see you and you cannot see each other. So again, if you'd like to ask a question, just put it in the chat, raise your hand, or use the Q&A. So we are very delighted to host Kimberly Hess tonight. Kimberly, if you'd like to come on screen.
There, hello.
There she is. Kimberly is the author of A Lesser Mortal, The Unexpected Life of Cochran. Kimberly earned a BA in economics for nonprofits at the global and local levels. Kimberly's writing has been featured on websites such as the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Women's History Museum, and Thrive Global. And she herself has been doing genealogical research since 1984. So tonight, Kimberly will present on suffragist and businesswoman Sarah B. Cochran and the process of writing a biography on a lesser-known historical figure. But it's all the more special because Sarah Cochran is one of Kimberly's ancestors. So without further ado, Kimberly, take it away.
Thank you. Let's see. I will share my screen. Let's see, here we go. I will go into, there we are. So first of all, I just want to thank you for having me tonight. It's really an honor to speak part of the Writing Family History series, and I was able to use part of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania's collection in some of my research on Sarah Cochran, so I'm happy to give back by talking about some of that. Tonight, I'll be talking about my book, A Lesser Mortal, The Unexpected Life of Sarah B. Cochran. I'll cover my research process, some of my research findings, and the process of writing Sarah Cochran's life. So whether you're looking at writing about a particular historical figure who had a life very similar to Sarah's or very different from hers, I'll try to cover some of the universal elements for producing a book about someone's life when you would otherwise think there's just not enough information for a book. So let's start with the place, which is southwestern Pennsylvania in Fayette County. You can see Pittsburgh near the top of the screen and Morgantown, West Virginia near the bottom. My family migrated to this area in 2 waves. The first was in the middle of the 18th century from eastern Pennsylvania and other mid-Atlantic states, and then after the American Revolution. And then the second was in the middle of the 19th century from the UK and northern Germany. and they stayed there until 1969. My parents moved to New Jersey because my dad was teaching at a college in New Jersey. So I was born and raised in New Jersey, but I would visit southwestern Pennsylvania on a regular basis, almost every other month or every month with my parents. Now, the area we were visiting was in this Dawson area that's circled. If you see Fort Necessity on the zoomed in area, or Mill Run, which is where Falling Water is, you'll get a sense of the general vicinity that we were going to and where Sarah Cochran was from. So I grew up knowing that I was related to this woman named Sarah B. Cochran, who lived from 1857 to 1936. And she was a bit of a local hero in Fayette County. She was my great-great-grandmother's cousin, and my family remembered that she put my great-grandmother through college in the 1910s. So this woman who's photographed on this slide is my great-grandmother. I grew up visiting the Philip G. Cochran Memorial United Methodist Church, which is pictured here. That's been connected to my family for 5 generations. And I was also able to visit Sarah's mansion, which is Linden Hall, and it's pictured here as well. Having that connection and getting to see those places was really special to me and made Sarah very real. And like many people who live in that area, I knew that she was from a financially poor family. She became a maid in the home of a man named Jim Cochran, who pioneered the Connellsville coke industry. He's not as well known as Henry Clay Frick, who is the person who ended up dominating that industry as time went on. While Sarah was the maid in Jim Cochran's home, she and Jim's son, Philip, fell in love, and they got married in 1879. They had a son in 1880. It was their only child. And after the unexpected and very early deaths of Philip and their son, James, Sarah took over the family business. She traveled extensively in Europe and Asia, and she built these 2 national register structures that you see on this slide. She also became the first female trustee of Allegheny College. Now, this was all I knew about her, and it seemed like quite extensive accomplishments, especially for a woman in this place and time. I thought that was everything that we could possibly know about her, but as we talk, you'll see that there's still much more to uncover. When I took my husband on his first trip to Western Pennsylvania in 2015, he couldn't find information about Sarah online, and he suggested that I write a Wikipedia entry about her. So I did that, and I published it in early 2017. And I was finding interesting information about her. So I decided to keep researching, and I started writing some blog posts for museum websites. And I recorded a StoryCorps recording with someone else about her philanthropy. By the time I gave a presentation about my research to the Fayette County Historical Society in September of 2018, the next step was really to write her first biography, even though writing anybody's biography had never really been a personal goal of mine. I had had a corporate career. I was at home with my daughter for several years, and I planned to go to the nonprofit sector later. But soon my goal was to write Sarah's first biography. And I wanted to write it in a way that would make it accessible in terms of reading length and cost to anybody. And I wanted to help Sarah's story to get out to a broader audience, because I think it has value to a broader audience. And I think it can also help other people who might be interested in telling the story of someone who has accomplished great things, but has been left out of the larger historical narrative. Someone who might be a lesser mortal in history, even though there's nothing lesser about them. So I decided to spend 3 years on this project because that was a viable window of time for me. I know you could spend a lifetime researching someone's life and writing about it, but in my mind, getting a product out sooner rather than later would make her more accessible for other historical researchers. I could focus 1 year on research, 1 on writing, and 1 on publicity and promotion. I knew I didn't want to take on an oral history project because that's a different project and it's different legally as well. So I worked on this project and the book was published in the middle of last year. And it's been so interesting to see where Sarah's story resonates and where interest has been created. When I spoke at an event a couple of months ago, I said that the project was a great example of using a liberal arts education because my academic, professional, personal, and volunteer backgrounds definitely came into play in creating a particular perspective on Sarah, from the way I wanted to research particular questions to the way I would manage this project of writing a book about her. So I will talk about my research and writing process next. Now, it's great to have primary materials for any historical figure, but in Sarah's case, it's really difficult to find more than a few at this point in time. Maybe more will bubble up as people are talking about her life. But for now, there are a few records about her in her own writing. For example, there was a wonderful letter that she wrote to the West Virginia Alpha chapter of Phi Kappa Psi in 1935, and it's been transcribed into the chapters for history book. So that was just fantastic. And I had several documents in my personal collection that really helped me in my research, and I'll talk about them a little later. But as a historic figure, compared to someone like the founding fathers, Sarah's documentation is often non-existent, or it seems like it may still be scattered among private individuals. I looked at a number of online preservation documents, like the Historic American Building Survey, the Historic American Engineering Record, and the National Register of Historic Places applications. And these helped me to get details about some of the structures that she built, a little bit of information about her, and in some cases, general information about a company town that was associated with one of her coal mining companies. I also wanted to give the reader background on the coal and coke industries that Sarah had in her business portfolio, basically to understand the industry. And because not everyone knows what one of her products was, which was coke, that's a byproduct of coal. It's very lucrative because it was used in the steelmaking process. So this is important to know about on some level to understand where her wealth came from. Now, I had studied industrial organization in college, and I was able to use that paradigm to kind of research and discuss the coal and coke industries. And while her businesses were reportedly in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, and Tennessee, it was basically research in Pennsylvania that I focused on just because I'm one person working on this. So I used the Pennsylvania Department of Mines reports from about 1870 to about 1930 for a lot of information about what was going on in that industry and with particular mines of hers. And I also visited the Coal and Coke Heritage Center at Penn State, and they had some invaluable resources, like a deed from the 1880s that had Sarah's signature on it before she was officially in business. So that was terrific. Now, I thought that Allegheny College was the only college that Sarah was affiliated with, and I came to learn that she was actually a trustee of multiple colleges. And I wanted to know how and why a woman from her background, especially with probably a primary school education, was able to be a trustee at colleges in that era. Because we don't have her words on this, I was in touch with different organizations, archivists at colleges where she had been a donor or a trustee, the American Association of University Women, and the Special Collections Department at Smith College to get a sense of why women in general were being placed on colleges' boards at that time and what qualifications were sought. I can't overstate the value of archivists in research because beyond helping you find information, they can suggest other materials as well. For example, in emailing Smith College's special collections about women and education, they made a suggestion to look at a book by Robert Lopresti called When Women Didn't Count, which is his research on how women's occupational data was portrayed in government records and how it did or didn't represent women's labor. So that's worth reading if you're doing genealogical research or if you're writing about a historic figure where occupational information comes into play. Now, suffrage and philanthropy were two larger causes that Sarah was very involved with. I found that it can be very difficult to find information about suffrage because some of that information didn't survive, and what did can be dispersed around different repositories. And while current women's philanthropy organizations typically focus on the future of philanthropy rather than its history, people at some of those organizations were able to connect me with scholars who were working on philanthropic history. So they were very helpful in those cases. Now, from genealogy, I used the friends and family associates and neighbors approach for doing additional research on Sarah. Ida Tarbell and Anna Howard Shaw were two people who left very good records that I was able to look at for different information. Anna Howard Shaw happened to speak at a suffrage fundraiser at Sarah's home, Linden Hall. And while I haven't heard of an extant diary for Sarah Cochran, Anna Howard Shaw's diary is at the Schlesinger Library, and it's been digitized, and you can look at it on your laptop at home, and it happens to contain a reference to Anna Howard Shaw going to Linden Hall and speaking at this particular event in 1915. So that was a great find. So let me go over some of my other research findings that may be of interest to you. First of all, Sarah took in much more territory than I had imagined. I thought of her in terms of southwestern Pennsylvania and the Morgantown area. She actually had associations with Otterbein University in Central Ohio, Phi Kappa Psi's West Virginia Alpha chapter at West Virginia University in Morgantown, where the fraternity house is named for her. And she was also a donor at Bethany College in West Virginia and a trustee of Beaver College, which used to be in Western Pennsylvania, but it's Arcadia University in Eastern Pennsylvania now. And as I said, she was a trustee at Allegheny College as well, and a trustee at American University. So the scope of her accomplishments and her network and the geography of her impact were much larger than I thought. She's still considered a regional philanthropist compared to someone like Andrew Carnegie, but this is a much larger territory than I was expecting. Now, sometimes you can find helpful information about other people in a community, and this was one of my findings that I wasn't expecting. To understand Sarah's life, I had to do a little research on her father-in-law and how he pioneered the Connellsville Coke industry. So I was able to answer some questions I've had all my life about why Jim Cochran wasn't as well known as Henry Clay Frick in areas outside of Fayette County. Sometimes very small details come up in the search, and I was able to learn things about her personality too. She was considered democratic. She was considered to be very sharp, and someone had written in a newspaper that people had tried to essentially pull one over on her sometimes, and she wasn't someone who let that happen. I found it fascinating, especially for this place and time, that she was always called Mrs. Sarah B. Cochran in any newspaper or other publication that I read. She was never Mrs. Philip Cochran. And I don't know exactly why that is. I don't know if it's because she wanted a separate identity or if it's because she interacted with people who already knew who her husband was. But one of the other finds that was great was photos of Sarah and even portraits of her, because there aren't a lot of these circulating. Even a relative who grew up in the Dawson area where Sarah lived said that he had never seen a picture of her before reading my book. And I think this is important because images of people make them so much more real than when we don't have those images. So the painting on the right is a portrait that I've discovered at Otterbein University since the book was published. There's also a portrait at West Virginia's Alpha chapter of Phi Kappa Psi in the fraternity house at Morgantown. So these were really great finds. I had hoped to find more information about her business role and whether she was taken seriously or had any agency. And until additional information surfaces, I think her philanthropy really provides the best paper trail at this point. But this is what struck me most. And I think this is what's important for especially women and lesser known historical figures. As I researched, I realized that genealogists and family historians have a unique opportunity to put stories like Sarah's into the historical narrative. We have information about lesser known individuals that historians may not be aware of. In Sarah's case, it's hard to find her if you don't already know she's there. So she's often missing from oral histories of company towns because she didn't live in one. And at a certain point in time, many of those company towns were owned by the Frick Coke Company. So the people being interviewed for those oral histories would be talking about Frick's company. She's also not included in some scholarship about women in mining communities because some of that focuses on women as miners' wives, which she never was, or it's about Mother Jones, and that wasn't the side of this that she was on. Unless you grew up with Sarah's story, it's very unexpected for a woman of this era to be the owner of a coal and coke operation. If a woman of means is in this industry, it's presumably as the wife of the owner of the particular company. Now, Pennsylvania's mining reports name mine superintendents and other managers. They name miners who were injured or killed in disasters. So we can trace the early part of her husband's career when he was a mine superintendent, but they don't really include names of any mine owners, whether they're male or female. So Sarah's missing from these particular records as well. And I've not found a professionally archived collection of any of Sarah's personal or professional papers, if any of these still exist. So my hope is that photos and letters and diaries or business paperwork, if there's any more out there, could go into museums and archives if anyone has that, whether it's the originals or copies of them. That would be very helpful for other researchers to find her. Now, she also doesn't seem to show up in other people's archived collections when they're accessible. Sometimes certain records are just sealed. Her letters to the president of Otterbein University are in that university's archive, but otherwise there doesn't seem to be very much of her own documentation that's been preserved. And like many people in the suffrage movement, there's not always documentation about their work in it. So her activism can be found in a couple of historic newspaper articles, but there's not very much information beyond that. And I feel like the suffrage information has been forgotten locally. So, when she is in documents, sometimes her husband would still be portrayed as the business person, and Sarah was portrayed as the philanthropist and his wife. That's understandable in some ways, looking at the era when she was alive, but it doesn't help us to understand how productive she was. And it also, perpetuates the idea that most of the productive labor in this industry was still done by men. One example of this is the census records. If you look at a census record from her lifetime, you can see her as a child in her parents' household, then as keeping house when she's newly married. But then when she begins a business career around 1900, we start to see a blank space for occupation, the word none, which you can see here, and the word employer, which is just kind of vague. The census recorded her husband and father-in-law with very specific job titles related to their industry, and it recorded her competitor, Henry Clay Frick, as a capitalist that suggested some kind of productive labor. So, this was very interesting to me. As long as she doesn't exist in many archives, scholars and researchers aren't going to find her, and she'll continue to be omitted from research about the places, organizations, movements, and industries that her life touched. So while my book can help people find her, she needs to be more visible and accessible in museums and archives and places that can preserve documentation, make it searchable on a database, and digitally accessible to researchers around the world. I've already begun moving some of my documents from my personal collection to archives, and I've encouraged others to do this so that she can be included in a more complete telling of history. For example, I had mentioned primary documents that were in my family. These are some of those. These are paper programs from the Cochran Church dedication of 1927, and it actually includes many more pages than what you see here, and from the bishop's meeting at Linden Hall in 1916. Paper documents that are nearly 100 years old are fragile, and in an archival box in my house, they're preserved, but no one else knows they're there, and I don't know if anyone else is trying to find them. So after using them in my research, I actually had them professionally scanned and saved as PDFs for about $10, so not a large investment. I donated the originals to the Methodist Archive at Drew University and sent the PDFs to various archives and organizations that might have an interest in them. And this is something anyone can do, either in the process of writing a book, or after a book is published, or instead of writing a book. One of my favorite research findings had to do with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania's collection. So while I was researching Sarah, I was trying to find a connection between her and H.J. Heinz, because a newspaper reported that Heinz attended a lunch at Linden Hall during this Methodist bishops' meeting in 1916. So I read a biography of Heinz, and it happened to discuss his work with John Wanamaker from Philadelphia in the Pennsylvania State Sabbath School Association in the early 20th century. And I remembered that organization's name because I had the certificate in my files as a memento of my great-grandmother, Henrietta Sproat. This is the same great-grandmother who Sarah had put through college. And I took a detailed look at this document now. And first of all, in the lower corner, it has H.J. Heinz's signature. So this is very exciting. If you're like me, descended from some mid-19th century German immigrants to the Pittsburgh area, this is a great find on its own, but there's more relative to Sarah. I began to wonder if Sarah would be connected to this organization, given that my great-grandmother was probably teaching Sunday school at a church that Sarah built. So I located the records for this organization at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Because of where we were with COVID, I didn't want to make the trip into Philadelphia at the time, so I requested research by mail. And Lee Arnold was able to locate the records and find Sarah's name in them as a sponsor of the 1907 World Sunday School Exposition in Rome. Now, this was entirely new information for me. I hadn't heard of any of this. I began to wonder if Sarah went to Rome with this organization, or if any of her overseas travel could have had to do with this. So it presents even more questions to be researched. Lee also pointed out that based on the records and the photos in them, it was clear that the leadership was entirely male and white in 1907, which isn't a surprise. But now we have more information about the world that Sarah was working in, and perhaps more questions about Sarah's interest in supporting religious organizations at a time when women's roles might have been changing in them. Now, once we've done all of this research, how do we write someone's life? On a tactical level, I made time to write every day, Monday through Friday, and I tracked my word count every week just for my own progress, because everything about this book's research and the writing of it is about incremental progress. I happen to enjoy working with language and revising and tightening up text, and I had to revise even some of my original ideas about the format for the book. And when I got to a certain point where I had a draft that I was comfortable sharing, I shared it with 2 readers. And then after making more revisions, I hired an editor, a publicist, and a publisher. I also found advanced readers who could read the book and provide comments for PR. And it's interesting because when I look back on it, about 70% of those advanced readers were people who I met through the project and the networking that it just naturally created. Now, I love to read history and biographies, and I think the structure of a book is really important in this case because the reader could be engaged in historical research. So I included a preface to explain the book's purpose and set expectations about a first biography about an unknown person from someone who was not a PhD historian. I also wanted to include my connection to Sarah and to Western Pennsylvania and some genealogical information for people who might have an interest in that. So I made that the prologue. So if someone's reading and isn't interested in that aspect of the story, it's easy for them to just skip that and go to a section that's more appropriate for them. So an important question that I had to consider was how to organize Sarah's life so that an audience who wasn't already familiar with it could follow it easily, just because she was so very active through a certain portion of her life. So the book is organized into 2 parts for 2 distinct periods in her life. The first is from birth to about age 44. That's because that's the time when her husband and son passed away. There aren't a lot of personal details for her early life, so this was actually a good point in the book for discussing information about the Connellsville Coke industry that she would be part of, where the Cochran's wealth came from, world was like at that time. And because Sarah also lived through the suffrage movement and married women's property rights acts, these were important to discuss there as well, because she would be involved in the suffrage movement later. Now, the second part of the book covers essentially the second half of her life, when she took over the family's coal and coke businesses, traveled, and became active in philanthropy and suffrage. And I found it easier to describe her work thematically, just because it allows readers to focus more on a particular topic. And if you're thinking about having your book used in a classroom where it might be assigned because of a particular part of history, like the suffrage movement, then this sort of arrangement might be helppful to consider. So thanks to the West Virginia Alpha chapter of Phi Kappa Psi, I have this letter from Sarah to the chapter from 1935. And I was able to reprint it. I got permission from the author of their chapter history, so someone who's reading the book can read the entire letter as well in one place with the rest of this information. As a reader, I tend to find acknowledgements and a bibliography very helpful because it's kind of like the breadcrumb trail for other people doing research. And in Sarah's case, until a subsequent book is written about her or other research is published, this bibliography could end up being the list of all known resources about her that are in writing. Now, my editor understood the value of a clear bibliography, and in this case, and she was really meticulous about making sure it was useful to the reader. So that was great to find in an editor. The last thing about the book structure is that I chose to include discussion questions just because I've known enough people who are in personal book clubs or corporate book discussion groups, and I thought this might provide some jumping off points for discussions about Sarah's life. Another consideration that you'll have to think about if you're writing a book about a historical figure who's not well known is images. Images are very important for making this person real, but the rights for a single image might be free or they might cost hundreds of dollars. So, the more images you include in the book, the more thorough it might be, but also the longer and more expensive that product at the end will be for a reader. So you'll need to balance thoroughness with cost in that case. So for someone whose life doesn't seem to have a lot of documentation, let's talk about how this research process filled out Sarah's life. When she was living around the turn of the century, her husband had been running the business until he died in 1899. Nobody really searches out Philip's will, just in talking about Sarah and Philip Cochran locally, but I got a copy of the will, and I found that he left a third of his estate to Sarah and gave her control of the other 2/3 for 2 years until their son was going to turn 21, and he would take over that 2/3 portion of the estate. He was in the University of Pennsylvania studying business at the time, so he was preparing for this. But interestingly, for 1899, Sarah is the sole executrix, and she's the only person named. There's no mention of any male relatives, male attorneys. She is, quote, in full charge, care, and control, which I think suggests something about Philip's ideas about Sarah's financial acumen. And it's very significant given that business at the turn of the century was still seen as a man's world. So this is a very interesting piece of reading in the will. Now, we had already known locally that Sarah and Philip's only child, James, died 6 months before his 21st birthday. But I learned that when he was at Penn, he had pledged Phi Kappa Psi. And this fraternity remained enormously important for the rest of Sarah's life. She stayed connected to it until she died, and therefore it was very important in my historical research as well. Now, beyond grieving and over the loss of her husband and son, she had these businesses in West Virginia and Pennsylvania and Virginia and Tennessee. And the business environment at that time would have been difficult for men, but there really wasn't a place for women. My research indicated that it became illegal for women and girls to work in or around Pennsylvania coal mines starting in the 1890s. And some miners even thought it was bad luck for women to be near a mine. So without personal accounts from Sarah or those in her orbit, it's hard to determine how she behaved in business, what ideas she had about her industry, why she stayed instead of cashing out, and who took her seriously among her peers and her employees. Philanthropy, like I said earlier, tends to present a better paper trail than business activity. But why did she become philanthropic in the first place? Her 1935 letter to the West Virginia Alpha chapter of Phi Kappa Psi is interesting because she says that when she was grieving the loss of her husband and son, a doctor encouraged her to think of all the schools and churches she could aid. So that's exciting to have her own words and to know how this person came to be a philanthropist when she was from such little money herself. Now, I had never heard dollar values of Sarah's philanthropy, but newspapers from the time of her death in 1936 reported values for it. And those values would be worth upwards of $43 million today. So not bad for someone who's a regional philanthropist in this area. There was a smaller portion of her philanthropy that could be called quiet, meaning there's not much of a paper trail. And then there's a larger portion that's more public and is estimated at about $2 million as of 1936, in 1936 dollars. And that's public because it's recorded in college bulletins, newspapers, or on names of buildings or department chairs at colleges. The examples of her philanthropy that I found were always related to her Methodist faith, her family, and causes that interested her, like suffrage and education. We can generally find her philanthropy concentrated in the areas where she was and had connections, so Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. In some cases, her philanthropy helped to shift power, meaning that she was investing in people so that they could create better lives for themselves and with skills than allowing them to continue to depend on her. So if we look at her educational philanthropy, it's quite impressive. You can see that she was a trustee at several colleges. She endowed academic chairs, which she named for herself and her mother-in-law. She was considered the mom of the fraternity chapter in Morgantown. And she was also a builder of 2 dormitories, and those were Cochran Hall at Otterbein University, which was named for Philip, and it was his alma mater and also the alma mater of Henry Clay Frick. It was always co-ed, and this happens to have been a women's dormitory until it was razed in the 1970s following a fire. This is Cochran Hall at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania, and it's named for her son. When it was built, it was the most expensive building on campus. And at Allegheny, this donation put Sarah in the same league as Andrew Carnegie, according to the college president at that time. Now, the best example of her quiet philanthropy is her putting local people through college. There's no advertised scholarship fund that I'm aware of. There's not much paperwork on this, so we don't know how many people she put through college, how she identified them, or what. We know that she sent both men and women to college, and I know my great-grandmother was one of those people. So this is my great-grandmother at her dorm room at what's now part of IUP. But if we wanted to expand on this part of Sarah's philanthropy, it would be a great oral history project to identify people whose ancestors or family members had been put through college by Sarah and what that meant to them. Now, as a Methodist, Sarah was very involved in supporting her faith, and in Fayette County, the town of Dawson was where the Cochrans had really made their money and invested. And after Philip Cochran died, Sarah had the local Methodist church move to another town and built this brick church, which had its own Tiffany window, which would have been very in vogue at the time. In the 1920s, she financed a bigger, more elaborate Gothic revival church for the Methodists in Dawson. And in addition to building these 2 church structures, she also built a United Brethren church that she named for her parents, which I had never heard anything about before. Now, the picture of the Sistine Madonna is there because this particular church has a copy of that painting by the artist L. Storm, who was in Dresden at the turn of the century. So you may not be expecting to see a Gothic revival church in a railroad town in southwestern Pennsylvania, but if you go inside, there's a copy of Raphael's Sistine Madonna as well. So in 1916, she hosted all of the Methodist bishops of the world at her home for their semi-annual meeting. And apparently this was reported to be the first time this meeting was ever held at a private home. It's not something people are still talking about. So there's very little information about this. And I was happy to have this schedule of services from it. Now, this is Sarah's home, Linden Hall. It was dedicated in 1913, and it still sits in the mountains of Fayette County. It has over 30 rooms. It was on 600 acres when it was built and had its own private train station when Sarah lived there. It also had 3 Tiffany windows above this doorway that you can see. Those windows are no longer in the house, but they were designed by Agnes Northrop to look like Linden Hall's garden in full bloom, and they're quite spectacular. The original drawing is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection, and you can see it on their website. Now, I was lucky enough to see the window when it was still at Linden Hall, and it was just beautiful. So I also grew up hearing that there were 60 Italian stonemasons who worked on the construction of Linden Hall. And when they were finished, Sarah offered them, she offered to sponsor them for American citizenship. So this is another example of some of her quiet philanthropy. And it's another example of where an oral history project could take off if we were able to identify people who were related to these stonemasons. Now, in July of 1915, Sarah opened Linden Hall to the public for what's been called a tea or a rally to raise money for the local suffrage organization. Pennsylvania was having a referendum on suffrage that year, and Anna Howard Shaw was going all over the state speaking at these different fundraisers. Linden Hall was one of those. Now you can see in the newspaper on the left that Linden Hall was meant to draw people's attention and attendance. The headline is "Beautiful Linden Hall, Influence for Votes for Women." The house was 2 years old at the time, and it would have been spectacular to see because in 1915, there were still houses that didn't have indoor plumbing yet. So whether it was curiosity about the house or curiosity about suffrage, 500 or 600 people paid $1 each to go to this event, which was considered Western Pennsylvania's suffrage fundraiser ahead of the state's referendum that year. So when Sarah died, her memorial included a service called the Ministry of Woman. And unfortunately, I haven't located a copy of that text, but maybe somewhere there is a copy that someone will be able to find. Now, I know that Sarah's from a very specific time and place and industry and religious denomination and circumstances, but I hope that this helps if you are interested in researching and writing about a lesser known historical figure who otherwise people would think didn't have much of a paper trail and wouldn't be able to find very easily on their own. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was great. Sarah, it's so interesting.
Thank you.
And that's a lot of work researching Sarah and compiling it into a book in such a meticulous way.
Thank you.
We have a few questions and comments in the chat, but before we get to that, why do you think Sarah was not previously identified as an important historical figure in Western Pennsylvania prior to this?
I think in some cases, people didn't know the full scope of what she was doing. I think there was some knowledge in Fayette County, some in Ohio, some in West Virginia, but I don't think there was a complete awareness. And she gets left out of publications like Who's Who in Pennsylvania, probably because she's a woman. And the assumption is that women's work wasn't as important as what men were doing. I also think that, over time, she will start to be forgotten or has started to get forgotten. So there was less of a chance that she would be put back into the historical narrative later. And most people who know her locally are probably thinking that it's someone else's job, like a historian's job, to find her and put her into history.
Right. Yeah. Excellent point. So we have some questions and comments coming in through the chat. So I'm going to switch gears.
Okay.
Katie Burke asks, what do you most wish you could learn about Sarah that you haven't yet uncovered?
I would really be interested in knowing how she perceived her business work and whether she felt like, it was difficult to be in business, why she stayed there, what her interactions with people were like, and then why was she traveling so much overseas? Was it just out of personal interest or for a particular agenda?
Fascinating questions you might not ever answer.
Yeah. Despite
how much research you do.
Yeah.
We have a few comments. My goodness, we have quite a few comments. From Karen Ellingson, I appreciate the combination of historical perspective and family history research in this presentation. And Karen says that I have added the book to my wish list.
Great, thank you.
Let's see. We have a question in the Q&A. Oh, it's quite long, so bear with me.
Okay.
My great-grandfather, William Henry Burchell, was killed in the Mammoth coal mine explosion on January 27, 1891. He was the father of a 2-year-old son and a baby girl. His remains were identified, therefore his wife, Margaret Burchell, took him home to Latrobe, and he was buried at St. Vincent's Cemetery. There is a record of their receipt of his body, but they do not know where he is buried. According to the newspaper, the mining company owner, H.C. Frick, paid for the burials. Is it possible there is a receipt someplace in all of Frick's records? If so, would you have any idea where these records may be located or who to contact?
Yeah, so I think the University of Pittsburgh has a collection of the Frick Company records, and the Coal and Coke Heritage Center at Penn State may be able to help you. I don't know how much documentation they would have on that, but they might be able to point you to a collection. I think that and Pitt would be the best.
Another comment, this is from Marcy Wen. Thank you so much for doing all your work and writing a book about Sarah B. My grandfather on my mother's side was Sarah B's nephew. My mother actually lived at Linden Hall as a young girl with her parents. Wow, great. Lots of other great comments coming in. Thank you, Kimberly. You managed to pack so much information about both Cochran herself and the research and writing process into this presentation.
Thank you.
Let's see. And someone else says, hopefully there's still a chance that more records will turn up in the region, which leads me to another question that I had. Have you learned anything new about Sarah since publishing the book?
Not a lot, although I visited Otterbein University in September. I had been working with the archivist there and was invited to speak, and we looked through more of the information in the archives. So we found more of her correspondence with the Otterbein president and a discussion they were having about whether or not male students should be allowed to eat meals in the Cochran dormitory that she built and why they should or shouldn't. So that was kind of interesting to see. I don't know what her understanding of life in a dormitory would have been like, or how much she knew from her son or other relatives who might have gone to different colleges. So it's interesting to think about, how she perceived life in this dormitory that she built. So that was my greatest learning since then. And then finding the portrait that was featured in the slides too. I heard stories about how the portrait was stolen and would pop up in different rooms in the dormitory while it was there.
Is that why you used a silhouette on the cover of the book?
I used the silhouette just because I wanted to include a reference to Cole, and I wanted a female presence to be part of the cover. But the silhouette was interesting because it almost looked like someone took a paper punch and punched her out of the picture. And then on the back cover, there's her silhouette with all of the text about the book. So it was almost like on the front, she's punched out, and on the back, we're filling in what we know about her.
Great. We have a question from Virginia. Virginia says, I'm related to Abigail Geisinger of Danville, PA. Upon the death of her husband in 1883, she ran their coal business in Kingston, PA. Abigail died in 1921, no children, built hospital in Danville. Perchance is this a name you came upon? Wondering and finding little about whether or not she worked on suffrage.
I don't remember coming across that name. You might want to check local historical newspapers for any suffrage references, because I know in Sarah's case, the Suffrage Fundraiser was publicized, but there would often be a list of every single person who was working on that project with her, whether it shows, Mrs. John Doe as the name or Jane Doe, depends on the newspaper and the people involved. But I would go to local historic newspapers and also local libraries to see if they still have resources about the suffrage movement. And then if there's a college in that area, because I don't think I'm getting the geography right for it right now, but a college that's nearby may also have information too.
That's great. Terry asks, I wanted to write historical fiction based on family history. Looking forward to reading your book. Where is it available?
Oh, so it's available on Amazon, and we have the link in the chat. And you can also buy it through any bookstore because it's distributed through Ingram. But because it's not Harry Potter, so they may not have a copy of it in the bookstore. You may have to ask them to order it rather than finding it in the store.
Great. Yes. And I just put the link in the chat to Amazon again.
Thank you.
All right. Another question that I had has this process allowed you at all to connect with other relatives or descendants of Sarah?
Yes. So Marcy Wen, who asked a question, and I have connected through this book via email. And when I was doing research back around 2018, I connected with one of Philip Cochran's relatives. And she actually did the StoryCorps recording with me about their philanthropy together. And we did a presentation for Women's History Month in March for a library in Western Pennsylvania. So that was really great. And then another person I had met through this, who's not a relative, but he has connections through his family to the person who owned Linden Hall years after Sarah did. And he's working on a documentary about Linden Hall specifically. So he invited me to speak on that documentary. And that one's called The Story of Linden Hall. And I know it has its website and its Facebook page if anyone's interested in that.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. We have more comments in the chat, but we can't get to them all tonight. But we will send the chat along with the recording in our follow-up email. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in tonight. It was a pleasure to host you. Please check back for more events from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This is one of our last events of 2022, but we look forward to seeing you in 2023. And of course, subscribe to our newsletter to stay in touch with us. It is hsp.org/enews. I will put it in the chat right now. Thank you so much, Kimberly. It was a pleasure to host you. And have a good night, everybody.
Thanks.